Hello and good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome to the Tech UK Futures Summit breakout session on mobility. My name is Theodora Koniva and I'm the Intelligent Mobility and Transport Program Manager here at Tech UK. For those of you who are not part of the program, the aim is to deliver a digitally enabled, interoperable, integrated and inclusive transport network that connects people and services with multiple modes of mobility. The program focuses on improving regulatory environment of the wider mobility services ecosystem by working together with government and engaging with industry and around priorities and key challenges. Today we will discuss some of the implications of the pandemic, but also explore the opportunities as well for the technology sector in the mobility and transport space. And we'll also discover how last year has impacted and transformed the way we think about moving through not only urban but rural environments as well. We will discuss some of the solutions industry is coming up with and how the digital tech sector is innovating, in some cases much more rapidly and faster than before. And of course, we will touch on some of the environmental impacts as well of those outcomes. I would like to introduce our speakers today. Paddy Latour, Head of Strategic Partnerships at Humanizing Autonomy. Marianne O'Sullivan, Policy Advisor for North East England Chamber of Commerce. And Mark Woods, who is the Chief Technology Advisor for EMEA at Splunk. Welcome, everybody. I would like to mention in advance that this session is being recorded and it will be vastly publicized after the event as well. And I would like to also encourage the audience to submit questions throughout the session, but please do remain on mute while our speakers are in discussion. Thank you. We know that this last year has had an extremely challenging, has been extremely challenging for the transport sector, and many of us, specifically living in London, for example, or in bigger cities, have felt a huge change on the way we move. But I would like to discuss a little bit in detail with Marianne, for how the Northeast Transport Plan has been designed, and speak to her a little bit about the future of sustainable transport and how people will access towns and cities. Marianne, over to you.
Great. So I'm Marianne, and I'm from the North East England Chamber of Commerce. Just going to give a quick update on the, like we mentioned, the transport plan for the Northeast. So this is covering the North of Tyne and Northeast Combined Authority areas, not Tees Valley. But one of the key aims of that plan is to make a green, healthy and dynamic Northeast. So there's a real focus on decarbonisation within there, but also the kind of dynamic and thriving elements link into the economy. I think that's kind of key to how, as a chamber, we view transport. I look after transport policy, but we see that as linking into creating housing opportunities, linking people to jobs and education opportunities, encouraging more businesses to invest in the Northeast, and overcoming barriers to employment, as the Northeast has quite a lot of people without access to private vehicles as well. So there's quite a lot within that, rather than kind of just thinking it as transport spending and it's only just going to get people from A to B. So the plan goes through to 2035 is kind of how it kind of operates. There's lots included in that plan, including active travel, bus corridors, and also looking at rail investment, local rail, and kind of rail in the Northeast as well. So that's kind of the overall kind of proposals. I think they total up to around 6.1 billion. So, and I think this is kind of the first time we've seen quite a lot of the Northeast put together a joint bid. So it's kind of helping to put a joint voice forward to government on what the Northeast needs.
And thank you so much. And what do you think have been so far some of the short-term impacts from the pandemic at the moment?
I think we've seen, obviously for transport mobility, we've seen massive impacts just because of some of the, public health restrictions on travel and lots of people working from home. I think looking ahead, based on conversations we've had with kind of transport operators in the Northeast, we might see, if we get to a point where people are, safe and allowed to travel, we might see a return in leisure travel quite quickly. But I think from the Chamber side on business travel, that's kind of an unknown at the moment. We don't know yet the impact of flexible working, whether people are going to move more to remote working. And obviously that's going to have a massive impact on towns and cities. So we're already looking at whether that's going to move more towards people living maybe in towns and cities, and then how would that work with transport mobility as well. And obviously we've seen decarbonisation and sustainability now becoming key as part of the Build Back Better strategies, and we've got COP26 this year. So I think that's really going to be a key theme as well going forwards.
So talking about decarbonisation, Paddy, do you think the observed changes in behaviour to date are sustainable? And what do you think are the future implications of those changes, for example, lack of or no mobility, urban planning, or in other sectors?
Yeah, a great question. Thanks for having me on this. I hope that they're sustainable. I think this is an opportunity to make them sustainable, but society also has expectations. So coming more from the city perspective and what we're seeing here in London, people loved bike sharing. They jumped on those bikes. There's an expectation that there's now more, that there's more stations to drop them at, that it's become more flexible. Same with the e-scooters. I think there's an expectation in society that if we're supposed to be moving in a more sustainable fashion, that the government makes it available to people. So I think those are kind of the key things that we need to think about, is how can we support behavior changes? And this is a moment to make them sustainable, but I think there's still a lot of work left to do.
Thank you so much. And Mark, given that the transport system haven't changed much in the last decades, why do you think we're still providing and maximizing on consuming mobility in the same way? And how do you think last year and, for example, probably this year as well, how do you think we need to reshift focus in terms of the design of the system? Oh, I think Mark has frozen. Paddy, do you want to discuss on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different things to look at. What we're trying to do is, I see Mark's back. I don't want to. Oh. If he wants to answer, he can go first.
I'm just frantically texting downstairs to ask my two youngest daughters to stop twin screening to suck the bandwidth. So thank you for bearing with me. No I think to answer that question, it's one of those hard. When we think about any of these, there's a mass separation, that huge investment we need to make, and the fact that this is something that's live, it's changing all the time. I think Patty was talking about how people are jumping towards bikes using different types of technologies or transportation systems, which are not new, but the way in which we start to use them and the way in which we start to interact with them is new, and that changes all the time. And I think the challenge for policymakers and the challenge for people that provide these services is understanding how that's going to change, so trying to make some predictions, but importantly being able to change dynamically on the fly. If we invest in a road, if we invest in a railway system, that's a long-term investment that once we put it in place, isn't going to change significantly. But as we think about urban centres and bringing people around, we need to think about the service, what we're trying to deliver. And really the only way to understand that is by sharing that data that flows through. We understand how people are interacting if we can share and have that common framework of understanding how people are using, utilizing, where the frustration points are coming in. And that's really why transportation hasn't taken that step forward, because we still think of it as a train schedule or a bus lane or a biking system in place, rather than thinking that overall service and the fact and appreciating that's going to change.
Patty, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the way we use technology is changing, but it's also kind of as simple as the way that we're using old hardware is changing. So in our case, there's a lot of existing CCTV cameras, and I joke sometimes that some of them, I think, might still be recorded on VHS tapes and stored somewhere. And then at the same time, we're trying to work with the most advanced connected camera system. So that's changing rapidly, and how does industry and policy catch up with that, meet in the middle, and the advanced urban centers, that's great, but what about the rest? How do we bring in these other areas and work together? So there's a couple of different pieces to that society side, but then also kind of the public sector side.
And Marianne, for example,
oh,
go ahead, Mark.
Flexibility. At the moment, you've got a plan that's in place, and we're in very strange times. How are you able to plan that, your sort of forward-looking 2035 view?
Mark, you're cutting a bit. And Marianne, for example, you're working with a lot of companies. What challenges do you think they see in designing their own mobility services in this particular situation, to say?
I think one thing just to pick up on that's been mentioned is kind of sharing data. And I think one thing that hopefully might be a positive kind of coming out of COVID is collaboration, because different transport operators have had to form a different relationship with government due to the impact on their business, and lots of operators are having to now work together to deliver key services. So if there is a positive to come out with that, I hope that kind of collaboration continues. And then hopefully if we also, as you mentioned with technology, if that can lead to data sharing, because that's going to be really essential, because at the moment nobody really knows what the new normal is, what will travel patterns be. So sharing that information, and then from that will allow people to have a bit more of a forward plan on what is needed. Another thing just to mention is I know we kind of talked about kind of, I guess, flexibility in technology and travel, but it's not always the urban areas. So we've got a trial in Tees Valley, Tees Flex scheme, and that's on-demand transport, but focused on rural areas. There's lots of people often dependent on cars, and there's not a frequent service. So those are kind of some of the trials starting in the Northeast. So it's not always just the urban areas that can benefit from this as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think with a lot of the tech innovations, and especially through utilizing data analytics, we will see a lot more accessible transport and a lot more real-time mobility sharing and so forth. But with regards to data, for example, we know that data is extremely crucial also for companies to innovate and make more informed decisions. But obviously, there's a lot of other constraints to opening data, for example. There's a lot of regulatory barriers as well. And at the moment, what we are seeing with the pandemic is that we also cannot utilize historical data as well. Can you share some of your thoughts on data sharing practices, and going forward, what kind of solutions we will have to think about in the coming year or so thinking about data sharing, because we know that it has taken a while for the sector to share data, for example. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
So I think that the important part here is that we've all been using data for a long time. And when we talk about data and how we're going to use data going forward, it means a lot of different things. I think the challenge we complement the stuff we have to do operationally to make sure that actually we have that flexibility, rather than just think of this as a thought experiment, which a lot of time it can sit into place. Data, we're talking about batches of data or just the specific parts that we think are going to be useful at that point. If there's anything the current crisis has taught us, it's the fact that we don't know what's going to be useful, and we don't know when that's going to become relevant. And when it does, it doesn't typically give you a 6-month notice to allow you to do a change transformation program. And that's why actually focusing on the operational side of things, whilst not quite as sexy as some of the innovation that you might see out there, is really important. Because thinking about the fact that you can share the data as widely as possible doesn't mean you have to actively share that data, but means when you need to, it's there and available. I think lots of the work for me that makes me slightly nervous is when we talk about data trusts. The whole concept of those is to make sure we can get wide sharing, not so that we can create a number of different pockets where you have to go to share that data. The flip side of that is then when you don't operationalize it properly, what you do is you take your staff, those people that need to focus their efforts on the so what, or actually doing a day job, and say, could you please complete this form? Could you please go out and count the people getting onto a bus? That's not the sort of thing. We're at the point now with our technology where actually that data is already available, as long as we're willing to take the step to operationalize it and then make sure it's accessible.
And Mark, given that we often talk about the importance of being data-driven, for example, why is it taking so long, and what are the biggest hurdles to overcome, would you say?
So it's an interesting piece for me as a technologist in the fact that the barrier here isn't really technology. Just like within actual transportation system, the actual frames themselves, whilst they need to become more ecologically viable, potentially cheaper, and most of the barriers to this is on ethos. So I talked a little bit before about actually being ready to share and actually making sure that actually that's one of the prerequisites when you look in a certain area to say, actually, I should be able to share all of this data as widely as possible. Sometimes that's hidden behind regulation or compliance. Sometimes it's just that people are intimidated by that particular process itself. The second step on this and becoming data-driven is starting to solve solved problems. And it happens all the time when we look at technology. Lots of the frameworks and the ways in which to do the system to be able to share that data is solved. Starting a project to look at a data lake or to look at data consolidation, actually the project should start with the service itself. And actually it should be flexible enough to move with those times, to move with the changing requirements. If you start off by saying we'll do a 6-month transformation project just to get all the data into one place, where you spent 6 months solving a solved problem, there are plenty of technologies that can do that you should leverage. What those technologies can't do is understand where it's relevant to your particular ecosystem, where you should build the railway line, where actually you should think about putting a bike system in place. It can enable that process, and that's where the focus and effort should be on the services and not necessarily on solving a solved problem. So in being data-driven, I think sometimes we get stuck in data wrangling. And when we get over that, it's sometimes then once we've started that process, unless we're willing to share and have the processes in place that are ready to share, we sometimes get stuck behind a compliance of, well, we couldn't possibly share any of that.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Patty, how can we, as a public and private sector, ensure that data is handled in an ethical, privacy secure manner while still enabling innovative mobility transformations?
Yeah, I think kind of going off what Mark said, one of the difficulties when you're looking at a 6-month project, you want to do something really quick. A lot of times you can be stuck doing a data sharing agreement, a DPIA for 6 months or longer. So while those are really, really, really important, and we certainly believe that we signed a lot of them on a daily basis, but we have to kind of think of a way how government can speed these up. So it's a challenge. How can these be made more efficient? Every public sector, it seems like, has their own forms, has a different template. So that's kind of one of the things that we want to flag. But you have to also work with ethical partners. So, a lot of companies have these privacy notices on their website. No one ever talks about them. No one ever checks them. That's a key step that, I would expect someone from public sector to do and ask the questions. GDPR compliance, it's a simple, easy question, but it's still overlooked a lot of times. And then lastly, a company should be able to explain to you not just what they're doing with the data, but why and how they're delivering the answers. So that explainable AI approach. They're using an algorithm. You have to really push them and say, okay, how did we get to this answer? Whether it's some sort of a data analysis, whether it's video analytics, facial recognition, whatever it is, we need to understand how the AI is working, because then also, you have customers behind you that want to be able to understand what's happening with their data. We all, use Google Maps, and we all have our data somewhere that's then in these articles, and I spent this time there. We have to understand why that happened, how it happened, and how it's being used. And only then will people trust the technologies. So those are kind of key steps that need to happen that are ongoing a lot of times, but maybe kind of get lost in all the talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. And we see this in many different sectors, in energy as well, when people are very reluctant to share data, but for example, they would share their bank details easily enough. But for example, they wouldn't share energy data. And it's exactly that knowledge piece that it's just lack of understanding and knowledge where and how that data is used. And it's highly anonymized in a lot of the cases, but still, we do see that reluctantness to do so. And once explained, or once people have an incentive to do it, for example, your journey will be X amount faster or cheaper if you share certain data details. If there's enough incentives, people do not mind sharing data. But yes, and you've touched upon government there, and regulatory and regulation. What do you think is the role for local government and central government in terms of ensuring that industry will be well placed to utilize those solutions and innovate fast enough?
I think it's openness and education. So we talk a lot about procuring AI and how difficult that can be, especially for smaller governments. That's where it has to start, for them to understand the opportunities that AI can bring, and so especially from the AI sector. Of course, also the threats. We have to understand that it goes back to the explainability, but I think only through that kind of meeting in the middle, they don't have to buy the most advanced pieces of software. We can start small and work our way up, but and tech has to help with that. It doesn't make sense to bring the most advanced things to the smallest areas and overwhelm them. So it's really about, where can we meet in the middle on this? How can we trial things quickly? So, we don't need to do a 3-year trial. 6 months, 3 months is enough. Get in there, deploy it, see what happens, and then go back to it. That's really kind of something that we always try to push is, quick and easy, do a quick analysis. You don't need hours of data. 10 minutes is sometimes enough. And so that's also a piece of kind of what industry has to do with government and educating them on that.
I think a lot of the time, the best data scientist that you have is the person currently running or operating the process. Because I think sometimes we get intimidated and think that because it's a machine learning technique or because it's a data-driven technique, that for some reason the expertise that you've developed in running that process, in knowing the interaction you have with citizens is sometimes not valuable. That's the most valuable piece. You can't explain the service and explain the process you're currently going through, way to benchmark whether it's better or worse. And actually being able to explain that to yourself means that you can actually validate some of the approaches that may be putting forward. Most of the time, those approaches are undermined simply by a lack of visibility of the data. It's amazing what you can do with a dashboard or a really simple indicator to an expert. And when they say, I can understand that trend, okay, if we have a particular sporting event in an area, I know that there's going to be congestion in an area. I know that when it rains, I'm going to have certain areas. So some of those indicators can be provided simply. And then you can start to understand how those processes, if they went into an algorithm or algorithmic process, that you can start to say, well, actually, I know when it's heavy rain, there's going to be this. That's simply a logic approach. And you can make those steps so you can start to understand the process.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Marianne, do you have any views on your own work and working with local partners on how can local and central government promote, especially those sectorial or locational innovations?
I think just thinking to kind of a few things that people have said, I think kind of if we're looking at a local authority kind of area, making sure there's, I guess, just capacity within that team. And part of that links into just funding. If everyone's kind of, if there's limited capacity, I think everyone will be focusing more on this kind of short term, maybe, you know, getting business support out for COVID. But if you have capacity within that team, they'll be able to, you know, have the ability to look a bit more at these kind of themes as well. And yeah, I think I agree, getting that trials and done quickly will give businesses an example, like you've kind of said, of the so what, and if the information comes out then you've got evidence of how that works. That will let kind of more trials progress, and we've seen that in kind of lots of different areas. A joint up approach, I think, could also work as well. We've seen some of that starting in the Northeast with procurement for businesses. If they kind of know what the procurement rules, that kind of helps them. But yeah, getting that a bit more joint up on data would also help. I think in terms of the kind of, I guess, so what piece, that can link to lots of different areas. So I guess on customer confidence, kind of maybe post-COVID, if people kind of know, you know, what services are busy, when's the best time to be traveling, and if we are looking at more flexible working, people might be open to more changing their behaviors, so there's an opportunity there. And also we've seen, I guess slightly differently, but I guess in the more design and manufacturing processes, in the Northeast we've obviously got quite a lot of automotive sector here, and we're looking at quite a lot at electric vehicles. And within that kind of process, there's quite a lot of work going on between both government and industry, looking at digital and data within that to make that more productive and to help with the sector growing here. So again, there's opportunities. I guess that's kind of more the supply chain of the transport sector, but it still kind of links in with digital there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what do you think is a big challenge for companies in the Northeast in terms of getting back to work or moving forward in a new capacity, to say? Do you feel like companies are a lot more innovating innovative at the moment, and government is responding faster, for example? Or
I think we might see, I know we've kind of mentioned behavior change in terms of kind of, customers and kind of transport, but I think businesses have obviously had to go through massive changes now in how people work. But I think it's not so much innovation as just people have had to do that. And now people are starting to kind of see the impacts of that and then think, how is this actually going to work in the long term? So I think we keep having these conversations. I think people are looking at this, but again, it's going to depend on kind of restrictions, how long this lasts and what people are doing. But I do think we will probably see more flexible working and more investment in digital capabilities. One thing that's coming out in quite a lot of our work is traditionally transport policy would be public transport, trains, road, that kind of thing. But digital infrastructure is coming in a lot more now. If people don't have access to digital infrastructure, that's, you know, harming their job opportunities, it's harming them from accessing meetings, and all the work around digital divide work of people who, for whatever reason, it might not be infrastructure, but just can't afford to access digital infrastructure. So I think that's kind of starting to come in a bit more as well. And I guess with the transport side, if we are going to be moving more online, whether it's on apps or anything like that, like on-demand travel, making sure people would be able to kind of access that on-demand travel if they're not online would be an issue as well.
Yes, absolutely. And Patty, for example, from your own business point of view, have you found that now going beyond the challenges, let's say the opportunities that perhaps the pandemic has provided to businesses, do you feel like we're managing to innovate faster, and do you think government is responding much faster as well because we have to come to a solution?
I think they did at the beginning. When you look at kind of the UK government response, you had the quick competitions that came out, and those were, you know, the 6 month, even 3 month trials of different ideas, and just a quick cash injection, which is all you needed to kind of, you know, trial different things. I think we're all now in this lull of, okay, we've done this, we've tried it, what do we do now? And it was a different type of uncertainty, you know, summer of last year than there is now. There's more expectations, things are going to end and turn around. So people are almost more hesitant to try new things when it comes to anything social distancing related or COVID related even. So I think it's kind of a difficult period. There's probably a lot of ideas that were born out of this last year that now are at a time and a period where they need to grow, where they really need to be, you know, not just tried at one location, but at multiple. And I hope those are being pursued and enabled. But I think it's quite difficult for a lot of people to figure out where do they fit. And you know, we talk about transportation, it's changing so much. And yeah, how are people going to be getting around in the summer? Are we going to be getting around? There's so many questions and different ones that, yeah, I'm a little unsure, but I'll remain kind of optimistic on it.
And Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
I think what we saw was an acceleration of things we're already planning to do. Mm-hmm. So whilst it was by no means normal, I think lots of things that went, if you to ask someone, you know, if you could pull something forward in your plan, what would it be? Lots of those happened. I think we were quite quick tactically. I think the challenge now, as Patty's been talking about, is how do you think about that long term? And the trouble at the moment is you have to think about long term with flexibility in mind. And that means that the kind of investments you have to make are those quick trials, so you can try and then move on. But you have to complement that, especially when it comes to transport and mobility, with the infrastructure that allows that, with the framework that allows that. And that's really importantly where government does come in, because as much as you can do a collaborative approach with other industry, other vendors, actually government needs to lead the way. And then local government, especially at the moment, I think has the flexibility to start leading that way, meaning that actually you provide the enablement for these things to happen. So not trying to pick, is it going to be a particular type of scooter? Is it going to be a particular type of transportation? But actually enabling whatever comes to fruition. And I think some of the great work that like Transport for London was starting to do pre all of the disruptions was actually, how do we start to make that more open?
Yeah.
So that people can start to innovate, even if it's as simple as an application on top, or different ways of moving people around that center. And I think that shows that by opening up that system, by making the investment in some of that infrastructure, you can still have the flexibility and you can still allow a more innovative approach.
Can you share perhaps one thing that has worked really well for Splunk last year, and perhaps maybe some lessons learned from your own experience?
When it comes to some of those mobility, so as a company, we were very lucky in the fact that because of the way we're sort of structured, that we were able to move online very quickly. I think one of the things that we found really good is the way in which we've been able to interact with some of our more mature customers in that kind of way, by actually showing them what they already have in place. And it's always fascinating to me when we say, well, we need to do this huge transformation strategy. We need to make sure we're leveraging some of these areas. Or actually you're able to say, no, you already have that at your fingertips. It's just a case of starting to move that forward. So if we were to look at, you know, to where actually mobility was a big thing for them, how do you move around campus, how do you move students around? Actually, their mobility has become more now what's the connectivity, and actually how do I make sure they're safe when students are being asked to go and do the face-to-face, which is really important as part of their study. And it was there we're actually taking data and bringing it together, saying, one, you have to be open in the fact that you're going to use this data for a different reason, but actually that data already exists. So tricky problem to solve if you've already invested in the structure and the framework. And you can think about the service that's being provided to those students to say, actually, these areas you shouldn't go to now, because we've linked this into ways and paths around the university. And actually, these are some of the things you.
I think maybe Mark's daughters are streaming. Patty, in the meantime, what about you at Humanizing Autonomy? What do you think has worked really well last year? And perhaps, sorry, Mark.
That's quite okay. You can do everything in planning, but you can't plan for a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Oh, God.
So it's probably what we've learned as well.
So I don't know what
yeah, you can plan all you want, but yeah, that's the Wi-Fi at home. No, but yeah, from a business perspective, it's quite similar. And kind of what I touched on before, people in general, the industry is eager and more open maybe to trying things. Yeah, kind of this openness to creative ideas. So sitting on a lot of data, for example, the work we're doing with the public transit authorities, they've kind of realized we have these resources, let's do something with them, and the resources being data. I think that was maybe not as prevalent before the discussions. And then interesting though is also then kind of the also country differences, international differences that we experience. So in the UK, it was quite easy, and we had that transition, and people were quite open and talking. Then dealing with, for example, with Germany, it was very different. The mindset was different solutions, different ideas, different problems. So I think that was quite a learning experience for us, and one that's still continuing this year.
And Marianne, for example, have you seen any completely new services and opportunities cropping up for companies in your region, for example? We know that things like social distancing monitoring or facial recognition is going to be a lot more common going forward, perhaps. Can you share maybe some experience you have with some of the companies you work with?
So in terms of innovation, we've seen quite a lot of kind of the digital companies in the Northeast and app developers in kind of when this kind of, I guess, the pandemic first started. Like I said, kind of with the social distancing, it was kind of in workplace apps that you like Bump and making sure people would be able to keep that distance. And on the transport side, something that's come up with some of our kind of conversations with combined authorities when we've put them in touch with businesses was around online deliveries. Obviously, we've seen lots of the kind of the marketplaces that we have in the city centres or small businesses. Everyone's trying to move online, and because of that, that's seen an increase in deliveries, which is affecting both kind of congestion, the decarbonisation agenda, and just who has access to setting up their online stores already. Obviously, larger businesses were more likely to already have that set up. So there was quite a few opportunities, I guess, for businesses who would be able to help with help smaller retail firms looking at online deliveries, whether that's kind of e-cargo bikes or anything else that's more sustainable, but also on the kind of technology side, helping retail businesses get that set up quickly because everything had to move online so quickly for them.
Thank you so much. And do you think there is a role for government to support financially any of those businesses or any of those changes in transport, for example? Is there any stimulus that should be in place for companies?
I think we've kind of seen, if the government has this focus on decarbonisation, and then for the Northeast, the kind of another kind of government agenda we're focused on is this idea of levelling up. And if you could look at kind of transport and technology, and a way of doing that would be helping businesses and people be more productive. If your aim is to increase kind of productivity in the Northeast, that's a way of delivering that. So I think if you kind of link it into those kind of key aims, if you have a firm who would be able to help you know, retail or any other sector become more productive, and it would be able to help with the decarbonisation agenda, that is something that the government can support. And if you're kind of helping a startup at this stage, if it kind of grows, that's developing more jobs, especially as we are going to possibly see, you know, long-term losses in retail jobs and other jobs and sectors in the Northeast because of this. If we're kind of helping new sectors start up, that's kind of really important for future opportunities.
Yes, and for example, in terms of decarbonization, we've touched upon sustainable practices for future mobility, but for example, we know that the Department for Transport decarbonization plan is coming up this spring. How can we ensure that obviously when the pandemic is somewhat ending, whenever that would be, we are pretty much sure that people will not move the same way they've done before? How can we ensure that we design services that are sustainable and encouraging in terms of reaching net zero? I think this is a question for all of the panelists.
I can go first.
Yes, go ahead.
From our perspective, and I mean also personal, it's how to make things safe. People are going to ride their bikes, ride their e-scooters, walk around, which are some of the most sustainable ways of getting around, if they feel safe. So when you look at urban planning, when you know, it was touched on the increase in deliveries, in freight, logistics that's happening in urban and rural areas. You know, people are not going to love riding their bikes next to HGVs and buses and these things. And then you, of course, you also have the personal preference of these fleets need to be electric. I don't really want to be stuck behind them riding my bike while their exhaust is blowing my face. So those are the things I think that if people feel the change, then they're going to, you know, support it, take it up, and yeah, do what they can.
I think the first stage you have to think is convenience. I think if we think en masse towards anything that we convenience, call that a benefit to them, but if that benefit isn't inconvenience, then we're back to that are. And I think then at the same time, how we start to measure that, and that comes then back to data. So we need to we'll drive that convenience that we're communicating them, so people can see that that's a way and from that behavior as we start to try and support the bits of convenience that are good and try and discourage some of those convenient behaviors is really jump into my car that are bad.
Yes, absolutely. Marianne, do you have any comment?
Yeah, just kind of agree obviously with both of that. I think kind of safety and confidence is going to be key for any kind of form of transport after this, especially I guess the more either active travel or public transport. I think people might have got even more used to either not traveling or traveling by car, so it's how you kind of get that behavior change back. Convenience, I think cost and everything's going to be a part of that, but I guess if you do have changes in how people are working, if it is moving more towards flexible working or working at different times, so you're not possibly having the same peaks of travel and congestion, that might also help to encourage behavior changes. And if you kind of get an offer out there for people that's new, that might help to also encourage change. And just link into the point on kind of, I guess, actual travel in urban areas. I think we have had kind of quite a lot of feedback around people kind of We've had conversations before around clean air strategies and everything like that. But I think this might have changed people's kind of perception slightly with the pandemic, and people maybe are a bit more appreciative of kind of green spaces, kind of, you know, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So hopefully that can kind of maybe link into the debate as well and change perceptions.
Thank you so much. I think we are actually at the end of the session today, but I would like to just ask our speakers if you could just very briefly express what is your expectation for this year, for example, in terms of industry, design, innovation, even Tech UK. What would you like to really see moving in terms of yes, transport? Is that a tough question?
I think I don't know. It's weird, but kind of just optimistic thing. So good news. That's really what I'm hoping for. Kind of, yeah, inspirational ideas. So sharing best practices. And I think that's what Tech UK is good at. Kind of from different industry sectors. Where can we learn what's happened and apply it in other domains? So that'd be something for us.
Mark, any thoughts? Marianne?
I think that testbed kind of idea, we've undergone massive change. There's nobody kind of knows yet what the new normal is, but there's an opportunity to test new ideas out now, and kind of see what happens and see what kind of takes off. So I think that could be something that we kind of look at once it's safe to travel. That could be something that we look at, testing new ideas.
Yes, and I think Tech UK's role is really to put forward those use cases, especially when educating policymakers in terms of what's possible and what is not, especially around procurement practices as well. But also, as Patty said earlier, innovate faster, maybe fail faster, but then design the next solution so we could move forward. Mark, did you have any final words for us?
I think, unfortunately, if you get any of my final words, they'll probably be crackly. So my hopeful thing is that we have a hopeful way of actually doing this in person in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for today. I think this was a really, really great discussion. And this brings us to the end of the Tech UK's Futures Summit.